Let me tell you something about clocks. A clock never lies to you. It doesn't care about your mood or the weather or who you are. It just keeps going, tick, tick, steady as anything. I've spent 41 years of my life winding the clocks at Stavemark Palace, and in all that time I learned one thing above everything else. When a clock stops, it's never the clock's fault. Something happened around it. Something interfered. That morning, one of my clocks stopped. The long case in the East Gallery, the one with the brass moon on its dial. I found it at 4 minutes past 9, hands frozen, pendulum dead still. And I remember thinking, quite calmly, that's odd. I wound it myself 2 days before. I didn't know yet that by noon, a man would be lying face down on the palace forecourt, and a boy of 7 would be the reason he was there. But let me slow down. You have to understand the place first. You have to feel it the way I felt it. Stavemark Palace sits at the edge of the old city in the kingdom of Haldon. If you've never been, picture gray stone gone soft and honey-colored in morning light. Picture tall black railings, gold at the tips, and a forecourt of pale gravel that crunches under your boots so loud you feel rude just walking across it. There's a fountain in the middle. 3 stone herons, water pouring from their beaks. In summer, the tourists throw coins in it, and the groundskeeper fishes them out every Friday and gives the money to the children's hospital. Little thing. Nobody made him do it. He just does. That's the kind of place it is. Old and quiet and full of small kindnesses that nobody talks about. I got there before 6 that morning, same as always. I like the palace best when it's empty, just me and the corridors and the smell of beeswax polish. I do my rounds with a little leather bag over my shoulder, my keys, my winding gear, a cloth, a small oilkin that belonged to my father. I go clock to clock, 52 of them all through the palace. I know each one by its voice. Some of them run half a second fast. I let them. A clock with a personality is a friend. Now the family. I'd better be careful how I say this because I loved them, and it's easy to make people sound like a fairy story when you love them. But they weren't a fairy story. They were just people. King Aldous was a big, tired man who worried too much and hid it badly. The Queen, Marisol, was the sharp one. She saw everything, missed nothing, and had a laugh that came out of nowhere and knocked the seriousness right off her. And there were the 2 children. Prince Edvard, 7 years old, serious little face, always thinking, always watching. He was the kind of boy who'd stand very still in a room and take everything in before he said a word. His mother said he was going to be either a judge or a nuisance, and probably both. And the little one, Princess Ivet, 4, all curls and noise and absolute chaos. She called me Clockman because she couldn't be bothered with my real name, which is Tobias, and honestly Clockman suited me better. She used to follow me on my rounds sometimes, holding the hem of my coat, asking me why the clocks talked. I told her they were counting. Counting what? She'd say. Everything, I'd say, and she'd nod like that made perfect sense. It did to her. 4-year-olds understand more than we give them credit for. So that's the family. Now let me tell you about the guard. His name was Rourke, Sergeant Callum Rourke. He'd been on the palace detail 11 years. Big man, but he moved quiet, which always unsettles me a little in a big man. He had this way of standing at his post that made you feel the whole building was leaning on him, and he didn't mind the weight. He never smiled on duty. Not once in 11 years did I see that man smile while he was at his post. But I'll tell you what I did see. Every morning the little Princess Ivet would run out onto the forecourt while her nanny hurried after her, and every morning she'd stop right in front of Rourke and give him this enormous, deliberate salute. Whole arm, very serious. And Rourke, who would not smile, would tip his chin down just a fraction just for her. A tiny bow, not enough for anyone else to notice. But she noticed. And she'd march off satisfied, like she'd inspected the troops and found them acceptable. I used to watch that from the East Gallery window while I wound the moon clock. Little ritual. Made me smile every single day. Keep that in your mind. The salute, it matters later. Now that morning. The moon clock had stopped, 4 minutes past 9. I stood there frowning at it, and I did what I always do. I opened the case, checked the pendulum, checked the weights. Nothing wrong, nothing at all. It should have been running. I want to be honest with you here, because I've told this story a lot of times over the years, and every time I'm tempted to say I felt something. That I had a chill. That some old instinct told me trouble was coming. That's not true. I didn't feel anything. I was just annoyed about my clock. That's how these days start, you know. Not with thunder. With something small and stupid, like a stopped clock, and a man standing there with an oil can wondering what went wrong. I set it going again, gave the pendulum a little push. Tick, tick, off it went. And I moved on to the next room, and I forgot all about it. Down in the forecourt, the morning was building the way it always did. The gates opened at 9 for the public. Tourists came in clusters, a coach party of older folks first, then families, then the couples who wandered slow and photographed everything. The sun was out, thin and bright. There'd been rain in the night, and the gravel was dark in patches. You could smell wet stone and cut grass. Somewhere a pigeon was making its stupid noise. I know all this because I went down at 9:30 to fetch a coffee from the staff kitchen, and I stood at the side door for a minute watching, the way you do. And that's when I first saw him. The man. I didn't think anything of him. I want to be clear about that. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't wild-eyed or shouting or any of the things you'd expect. That's the thing people always get wrong about danger. They think it announces itself. It doesn't. It stands in a crowd of tourists in a gray jacket looking at the palace, same as everyone. But there was one thing. He wasn't looking at the palace the way tourists look at it. Tourists look up. They look at the flag, the windows, the fancy stonework. They point their phones at the roof line. This man was looking at the ground. He was looking at the layout, at where the railings met the gate, at where the guards stood and where they didn't. His eyes moved along the forecourt in a slow, flat sweep, and there was no wonder in it. No holiday feeling, just measuring. I noticed it for maybe 3 seconds. And then a coach party moved between us and he was gone from view, and I got my coffee and went back up to my clocks. 3 seconds. That's all the warning I had, and I didn't even know it was a warning. I've thought about that a lot since. 3 seconds where I looked right at him and my mind just quietly filed him under nothing and moved on. We do that all the time, don't we? We look right at the thing and don't see it. Around 10, the children came out. This was routine. Mid-morning, weather permitting, the nanny, her name was Sofa, a patient woman with a soft voice, would bring Edvard and Ivid out to the private garden on the east side, which is walled off from the public forecourt but not entirely separate. There's an ornamental gate between the two, iron, usually kept shut. Through the bars, if you were a tourist, you might catch a glimpse of the royal children playing, which of course delighted people no end. Cameras up. Whispers. Look, look, is that them? The children were used to it. Ivid used to wave at the tourists through the bars like a tiny politician. Edvard didn't wave. Edvard watched. I saw them go out because Ivid spotted me at the gallery window and blew me a kiss and nearly fell over doing it, and Sofa caught her by the collar. I laughed, waved back, went to wind the drawing room clock. And here is the part where I have to slow right down, because everything that happened next happened in the space of about 90 seconds, and it took me weeks afterward to put it in order. I was at the drawing room window, which looks down over the east garden, so I had a view. Not the whole thing, the angle cuts off the far corner near the ornamental gate, but a view. The children were on the lawn. Ivid was doing that thing small children do where they run in a circle for no reason and get dizzy on purpose. Edvard was sitting on the low wall by the roses, doing something with a stick. Sofa was on the bench close by, watching them the way a good nanny watches, half relaxed, half not. The gray jacket man was at the ornamental gate. On the public side, behind the bars, just one more face at the railings, one more tourist getting a glimpse. Except he'd got himself right up against the gate, and he had his hand through the bars. Now I need you to understand something about that gate. There's a gap. Always was. The iron bars are wide enough at the bottom that a slim adult arm can reach through, maybe to the elbow. It had never mattered before. What's the harm in an arm through a gate? Nothing beyond it but garden. But little Ivet, in her dizzy running and her chaos, had drifted. She'd wandered from the middle of the lawn toward the roses, toward the gate, the way children drift toward anything bright, and the man had something bright in his hand. I couldn't see what. From the window it looked like a toy, a little colored thing. He was holding it out through the bars, low, at child height, and he was saying something I couldn't hear. The window was shut, and Ivet had stopped running and was looking at it. The way children look at a bright thing held out to them. My stomach dropped. I didn't understand why yet. My body understood before I did. That's a real thing, by the way. Your body knows first. Mine went cold before my brain had a single word for it. I banged on the window. Stupid, pointless. Nobody could hear me through the glass 2 floors down. I banged anyway, hard enough to rattle the pane, and I saw Sofa's head turn, not at me. She couldn't hear me either, but at Ivet. She'd finally seen where the child had drifted. She was getting up off the bench. But she was too far, 10 yards, maybe more, and Ivet was 1 step from the gate. And here's the thing I'll never forget. Here's the thing that still wakes me sometimes. The one who moved first wasn't Sofa. It wasn't a guard. It wasn't me. It was Edvard. The boy, 7 years old, sitting on the wall with his stick, thinking his serious thoughts. He'd been watching. Of course he'd been watching. Edvard always watched. He was off that wall like a dropped stone. And he didn't run at the man. He wasn't a fool. He was 7. He ran at his sister. Threw both arms around her from behind and hauled her backward, both of them going down onto the grass in a tangle, and the bright toy fell from the man's hand and lay there in the gap under the gate, and the man's arm was still through the bars, reaching, fingers open, into empty air where the little girl had been half a second before. I was already running. I don't remember deciding to. I was on the stairs, 2 at a time, which at my age is a genuinely bad idea, and I nearly went head first on the landing. My leather bag was still over my shoulder, keys jangling like an alarm nobody could interpret. I remember that sound, jangling all the way down. By the time I burst out the side door onto the forecourt, the whole shape of the morning had changed. Sofa had reached the children and had both of them scooped against her, Ivet crying now, that delayed cry small children do, the fright arriving late, and Edvard white-faced and silent, gripping his sister's hand, staring at the gate. And on the public side of the railings, the gray-jacket man had straightened up and was walking away. Not running, walking, calm as you like, back into the crowd of tourists, folding himself into them, becoming one more gray jacket among 40. In 10 seconds he'd be gone. In 20 he'd be out the main gate. And what would anyone even say he'd done? Held out a toy to a child through a fence. There's no crime in that. There's no name for that. He'd have walked out clean, and we'd have spent the rest of our lives with a bad feeling and no proof. That's what would have happened. Except for the boy. Edvard let go of his sister's hand, and he walked, this small, serious 7-year-old boy, still white as paper, right up to the railings, closer to that man than I'd have wanted him, and he lifted his arm. And he pointed straight at the gray-jacket man's back through the bars, and he said one word. I heard it this time. I was close enough now. He said it clear and hard, in a voice far too steady for a child who'd just been that frightened. Him. That's all, one word. And here's where the clock in my chest seemed to stop, the way the moon clock had stopped that morning, because everything went still and slow. Because Sergeant Rourke was there. I don't know when he'd arrived. Guards move quiet, I told you. 1 second the forecourt was just tourists and a fleeing man and 2 frightened children, and the next Rourke was there, at the edge of my vision, and he had followed the line of that small pointing arm the way you'd follow a rifle sight. From the boy to the man. And Rourke's whole body changed. I've never seen anything like it before or since. It was like watching a building decide to move. Everything about him that had been still for 11 years came awake at once. His hand went to his side. His weight shifted forward. And his voice, God, his voice, came across that forecourt like something dropped from a great height. You stop where you are. The crowd froze. The tourists, the coach party, the couples with their cameras, every single one of them stopped. Because a voice like that doesn't ask, it arrives, and your body obeys it before your mind has a vote. Every single one of them stopped. Except the gray jacket man. He ran. And Rourke went after him, and his hand was already moving, and I stood there on the pale gravel with the fountain pouring behind me and the pigeons scattering into the sky. And I thought, with a strange calm clarity, the same thing I'd thought about my clock that morning. Something happened around it, something interfered. Only this time I knew what. Let me tell you what a running man looks like on a forecourt full of people. He looks like a stone thrown into still water. Everything moves away from him. The tourists near the gate saw him coming and did what people always do. They didn't grab him. They didn't trip him. They got out of the way. A path opened up in front of him like he was royalty himself. That's the terrible thing about a crowd. It'll clear the road for the very man it should be stopping. He was fast. I'll give him that. Whatever else he was, he could move. He went for the main gate in a dead sprint, gray jacket flapping, and for 1/6 I thought he'd make it. I thought he'd be out on the public street and into the city and gone forever, and all we'd have would be a pointing boy and a dropped toy and a story nobody would believe. But Rourke. I keep coming back to Rourke because you have to understand, he didn't run like a panicked man. He ran like a man who'd already done the arithmetic. He didn't chase the gray jacket man in a straight line. He cut the angle. He'd seen where the man was heading and he ran for the gate itself, not for the man, and the two lines were going to meet. And as he ran, he shouted, not at the man now, at the two guards on the outer gate. Close it, close the gate. I saw the two outer guards react. Young lads, both of them, and to their credit they didn't freeze, they heaved on the great iron gate, the one that hadn't been shut in daylight hours in years, and it came swinging in on hinges that shrieked like something wounded. Old iron. It doesn't want to move fast, but it moved. The gray jacket man saw the gate closing and changed direction. Broke left, toward the railings, toward a low section by the Heron's Fountain where a fit man might just get a hand up and over. That was his mistake, because breaking left took him straight back across the open forecourt. Straight across Rourke's line. I was maybe 30 feet away. I saw the whole thing and I've never been able to unsee it, though I'll tell you now, it wasn't what the headlines made it. Headlines love a simple story. Guard opens fire, 3 words, clean. But it wasn't clean and it wasn't simple, and if you were there you'd know that a real moment like that has 100 small pieces in it and every one of them matters. Here's what actually happened. The man breaking left put his hand inside his gray jacket. Now you have to understand what that means to a man like Rourke. 11 years standing post. 11 years of watching hands, because hands are what they teach you to watch, not faces. Not eyes, hands, because a face can't hurt you and a hand can. And a hand going inside a jacket on a fleeing man, 10 yards from where 2 royal children are standing. Rourke drew his weapon. I heard him shout again, and this time there was no anger in it at all, which was somehow worse. Just flat, clear command. Show me your hands, hands where I can see them. The man didn't. He kept running, kept reaching. And whatever was in that jacket, he was pulling it free, and I saw the shape of it come out dark against the gray cloth. And Rourke fired. I won't pretend I remember the sound properly. People say a gunshot is loud, and it is, but on that forecourt. In that morning air, it wasn't a bang so much as a crack that went straight through my chest and out the other side. The pigeons went up all at once, the whole sky full of them. Somebody screamed. A lot of somebodies actually all at once, that high thin sound a crowd makes. The gray jacket man went down. Not dramatically, not like the films. He just folded, took two more stumbling steps and folded down onto the pale gravel by the fountain, and the dark thing spun out of his hand and skittered away across the stones. And here is the moment I want you to sit with, because it's the moment that told me exactly what kind of man Rourke was. He did not stand there. He did not lower his weapon and take a breath and let the enormity of it land on him, the way I think most men would. The very second the man was down, Rourke was moving again, but not toward the man he just shot, toward the children. He put himself between the fallen man and Edvard and Ivet. Big body, back to the threat, facing the kids, one arm out and low and steady. Because in his mind it wasn't over. There might be a second man. There might be a weapon still in play. And his one job, the only job, the whole job, was to make sure nothing else could reach those two children. He'd fired a shot and dropped a man, and his very next thought was shield. Not did I do the right thing. Not what have I done. Shield. I've thought about that more than almost anything else in this story. That in the worst second of his life, that man's instinct was to make himself a wall. The forecourt was chaos now. Tourists running, some toward the gates, some just running in circles the way people do when fears got them and there's nowhere sensible to go. The two young gate guards were pounding across the gravel. Somewhere an alarm had finally started up, too late to be any use, that idiot electronic wailing. And I, old clock man, 63 years old with a bag of keys, I did the only useful thing I could think of. I went to the children. Sophia had them still pressed against her, but she was shaking so hard she could barely stand, and I got an arm around all three of them and steered them back toward the side door, away from it all, murmuring the sort of nonsense you murmur. It's all right now, it's all right, come away, come inside, that's it. Ivet was crying into Sophia's shoulder, that exhausted broken crying of a small child who's frightened past her ability to understand. She kept saying one thing. The man had a toy. The man had a toy for me. Over and over. Like she was trying to make sense of how something that started with a toy had ended with all this noise. That'll break your heart if you let it. A little girl who can't work out why the nice man with the toy made everyone scream. But Edvard wasn't crying. He walked with me back toward the door, and he was still white as paper, and his hand in mine was cold as river stone, but he wasn't crying. He kept looking back over his shoulder, not at the fallen man, at Rourke, watching Rourke stand his shield wall over the empty air where the children had been. And at the door, before I got him inside, he stopped, dug his heels in, wouldn't move, and he looked up at me with those serious eyes and he asked me a question I did not know how to answer. Is the guard in trouble? I opened my mouth and nothing came out, because the honest answer was yes. The honest answer was that a man had drawn a weapon and fired it on a public forecourt in front of 100 witnesses and dropped a human being onto the gravel, and there is no world, no kingdom, no law, where that man doesn't face the hardest questions there are. Rourke was in trouble. Deep trouble, the kind that follows you the rest of your life whether you were right or wrong. But I couldn't say that to a 7-year-old who just saved his sister's life. So I said, he did his job, Edvard, he protected you. Whatever happens now, you remember that. He did his job. Edvard thought about that. He always thought before he spoke, I told you. And then he nodded once the way his mother nodded, and he said, then I'll tell them what I saw. They have to listen to me. I'm the prince. Lord help me, I nearly went to pieces right there. 7 years old, still shaking, and already working out that the one weapon he had was the truth, and that his voice might be the thing that saved the man who'd saved his sister. I got them inside. Now, I wasn't in the rooms where the grown-up things happened after that, so I'll tell you what I know, and I'll tell you plain where I'm guessing, because I won't dress up a guess as a fact. That's not honest, and this story deserves honest. Here's what I know for certain. The man survived. Rourke's shot took him low in the leg, and I later heard from one of the young gate guards that this was not luck, that in the half-second he had, Rourke had aimed to stop, not to kill. A man in a blind panic doesn't do that. A man in a blind panic empties everything into the center of the target. Rourke, in the worst second of his life, made a choice, and the choice was to bring the man down without ending him if he could. Whether that was training or mercy or both, I couldn't tell you. Maybe there's no difference in the end. The dark thing that spun out of his hand across the gravel, the thing that had made Rourke fire, I'll tell you what it was, and I'll tell you it plain, because this is the part people always want to argue about. It was a weapon, a real one, not a phone, not a toy, not a wallet, not any of the things the man's defenders would later claim. The whole forecourt was searched inch by inch, and it was found, and it was real, and it was loaded. And I want to be fair, because a story that's only fair to one side isn't the truth. No one will ever be able to prove exactly what the man meant to do with it. That went to court. That was argued for months. What was his plan? Was the toy a lure? Was he there for the little princess specifically, or was he a broken, dangerous man who'd have done harm to anyone? The court decided some of it. Some of it we'll never know. A man's intentions live inside his own head, and they die there. Here's what I believe, for whatever an old clockwinder's belief is worth. I believe a man who measures a forecourt with flat, wondering nothing eyes, who works out where the guards stand and where they don't, who brings a bright toy to a fence and a loaded weapon under his jacket. I believe that man came to Buckingham Palace that morning to do something terrible. And I believe a frightened 7-year-old boy and a guard who watched hands are the only two reasons he didn't. But belief isn't proof. I know the difference. My father taught me the difference over a workbench full of broken clocks. You don't say a thing is fixed until it runs. You don't say a thing is true until it's proven. What was proven in the end was enough. The man was tried and convicted, not for what he might have done, but for what he did, which was breach a royal perimeter armed and dangerous with clear intent to harm. That much was solid. That much held. And Rourke? Well, that's part 3. Because what happened to Rourke and what a small boy did about it is the part of this whole story I most want you to hear. Let me just tell you one more thing about that afternoon before I stop. I went back to my clocks. I know how that sounds. The world's fallen in and the old man goes back to winding clocks. But I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and my hands needed doing something, or I think they'd have started shaking and not stopped. So I did my rounds, room by room, and when I got to the East Gallery, to the long case with the brass moon on its dial, the one that stopped that morning at 9:04, the one I'd set going again and forgotten about. It had stopped again. Same time, 9:04. I stood there a long while looking at that frozen dial, and I'm not a superstitious man, I want to be clear, I fix clocks, I know they're only springs and weights and brass, but I stood there and I thought 9:04. That was almost exactly the hour the gray-jacket man first came through the gate that morning. I checked the log later. Public admissions opened at 9. First rush of the day, 9:04. The hour he walked in, my clock stopped. I don't have an explanation. I don't offer one. I only tell you it happened because it's true, and because it's the kind of small, strange, true thing that a made-up story never bothers to include, and I'd rather you believe me. I set the clock going again, tick, tick. And this time it kept running. They took Rourke's weapon that same afternoon, and they took Rourke with it. That's how it goes, and it's right that it goes that way, even when it feels wrong. A man discharges a firearm and drops another man in a public place. And the law can't just pat him on the back, no matter how many children he saved. There has to be a reckoning. There has to be a proper cold look at exactly what happened and why. Otherwise, you've got guards firing on hunches, and that road ends somewhere very dark. So they took him. Not in chains, nothing like that. But he was suspended from duty, and there was an inquiry, And for a long stretch of weeks that big quiet man sat at home in a small flat on the east side of the city, while lawyers and officials picked over the worst 90 seconds of his life like crows on a wall. The palace couldn't be seen to interfere. That's important to understand. If the king had simply declared Rourke a hero and waved the whole thing away, no one would ever have trusted the verdict. Justice that's handed down as a favor isn't justice. So the family had to stand back and let the law do its slow, grinding work, and it must have half-killed them to do it. I know it half-killed the boy. Because here's the thing about Edvard, he would not let it go. I heard about this from Sofa mostly and from one of the housemaids and later a little from the boy himself. He asked every day what was happening to the guard. He asked his mother. He asked his father. He asked the officials who came and went. Where is the guard? Is the guard all right? When can the guard come back? Have you told them what I saw? And the grown-ups did what grown-ups do. They said, these things take time, Edvard. They said, it's complicated, Edvard. They said, you don't need to worry about this. Wrong thing to say to that particular boy. Because Edvard had already worked out, on the day it happened, standing at that door with his cold little hand in mine, that his voice might be the thing that saved Rourke. And now the grown-ups were telling him to be quiet and wait. And he was 7, and small, and had no power in the world except one: he was the prince, and he had seen the whole thing, and he was a witness. So one morning, without telling anyone, Edvard put on his good coat. Sofa found out because a footman spotted the boy marching down the main corridor, alone in his best coat, jaw set, heading for the room where the inquiry was sitting. He'd found out where it was. 7 years old, and he'd found out where the inquiry was meeting, and he'd decided that if the grown-ups wouldn't take his account to them, he'd take it himself. By the time they caught up with him, he was already at the door, and there was a small, terrible standoff. This tiny boy in his good coat and a huddle of anxious adults. And Edvard said, Sofa swears this is word for word. I am a witness, you have to hear a witness, that's the law. Now where a 7-year-old learned that a court has to hear a witness, I have no idea. Maybe he read it. Maybe someone said it near him once and he filed it away, the way he filed everything away. But he was right. That is the law. And the thing about a truth spoken by a child is that it strips away all your clever adult ways of avoiding it. They let him speak. Not in the formal inquiry, you can't have a child cross-examined by lawyers, and no one was going to allow that. But they took his account properly, with his mother beside him and the right people present and everything written down. And the boy told it, all of it, in order, calm, exact, in that serious little voice. What the man did, where his hand was, the bright toy through the bars, how his sister drifted toward it, how he pulled her back, how the man reached into his jacket. How Rourke shouted twice, show me your hands, before he fired. That last part mattered more than anything. Because the whole question, the whole hinge of the inquiry, was whether Rourke had given the man a chance, whether he'd warned him, whether a reasonable man in Rourke's place, seeing what Rourke saw, would have believed there was a deadly threat to the children. And here was a witness, the closest witness of all, the child himself, saying clearly that the guard shouted twice, that the man was warned, that the man kept reaching, that the hand came out of the jacket with something dark in it before the shot. The tourists' accounts backed it. The other guards backed it. But it was the boy's account, I always believed, that turned the cold official process warm. Because you can argue with a tourist's shaky memory. It's very hard to argue with a 7-year-old who watched a man reach for his little sister and has been carrying every second of it, exact and unblinking, ever since. The inquiry ran its course. It took most of a season, but when it ended clean. Rourke was cleared, fully. The finding was that he'd faced a genuine and immediate deadly threat, that he'd given proper warning, that he'd used the minimum force he reasonably could, the low shot, the choice to stop and not to kill, and that his actions had almost certainly prevented grievous harm to a child. Cleared every count. I was there the day he came back to the palace. I made sure I was. I stood at the east gallery window, the one over the forecourt by my moon clock, and I watched him walk back across that pale gravel to take up his post again. Same steady walk, same big quiet frame. He looked older. Something in his face had been through the fire and hadn't come back quite the same. The way a clock that's been dropped never runs exactly as it did before, even after you fix it. But he walked to his post, and he took his place, and he stood. And I want to tell you what happened next, because it's the whole reason I've told you this story at all. The children came out. Mid-morning, weather permitting, same as ever. Sofa brought them out onto the forecourt. They changed the arrangements at the ornamental gate by then, of course, sealed that gap for good. But the routine went on because you can't let a routine die or the fear wins. And little Ivet came out into the sun, curls everywhere, and she saw Rourke standing at his post for the first time since that terrible morning. And she stopped. And she gave him her salute. Whole arm, very serious, exactly like always. She was too young, I think, to understand everything that had happened, the courts, the weeks, the weight of it. But she understood that her guard had gone away and now he was back, and there was only one proper thing to do about that. She saluted him. And Rourke, who does not smile on duty, who had not smiled at his post in 11 years, who had just walked through the worst months of his life. Rourke smiled. First time I ever saw it. First time anyone did. Not a tip of the chin this time. A real, whole, breaking open smile right there at his post at a 4-year-old salute. And then he did the small bow, the tiny one just for her, and she marched off satisfied, troops inspected and found acceptable, whirled back in order. I had to step back from the window. I don't mind telling you. 63 years old, and I had to step back from my own clock and take a minute. Edvard came out behind his sister, and he didn't salute, that was never his way. He just stopped in front of Rourke and looked up at him, and Rourke looked down at him, and neither of them said a word for a long moment. And then Edvard put out his hand, the way a man does, and Rourke, this enormous guard, back straight in full dress. Rourke crouched down on the gravel to the boy's level, so they were eye to eye, and he took that small hand in his huge one and he shook it, once, proper and grave, like two men who understood something between them that nobody else ever would. I don't know what the boy said to him, if anything. I was too far and the window was shut, but I like to think it was nothing. I like to think they just shook hands, the guard who fired and the boy who pointed, and that was all that needed saying. That was years ago now. Edvard's grown. He's the serious young man his mother predicted, and half a nuisance too, and Ivet's a whirlwind of a girl who still can't be bothered with anyone's proper name. Rourke stood his post another 6 years and then retired with a full pension and honors, and he lives out past the east side now, and I hear he keeps bees, which somehow doesn't surprise me at all. A man who spent his life watching over small things. And me, I still wind the clocks. 41 years became 48. My hands aren't as steady as they were, but a clock doesn't mind a slow hand, only a careless one, and I've never been careless. The moon clock in the East Gallery runs perfectly, by the way. Never stopped again after that morning. I check it every day out of habit, and it's never once been wrong. I think about that a lot. How a clock stopped the very hour danger walked through the gate, and started again the moment the danger was down, and has kept faithful time ever since. I don't have an explanation, and I've stopped looking for one. Some things you just carry. But here's what I've settled on. In my old age, after a lifetime of springs and weights and brass, we think the world is held together by big things, kings and laws and great strong men at their posts, and it is some. But that morning taught me it's really held together by small things arriving at exactly the right second. A boy who watched instead of playing, a guard who watched hands instead of faces, an old man who happened to be at a window, a little girl one step slower than she might have been. Take away any one of those small things and it's a different story, a terrible one. So when people ask me, and they still do, all these years on, who really saved that little girl, the guard, or the boy, I always give the same answer. Neither of them saved her alone, and both of them saved her completely. And I think that's how it always is, if you look close enough. Nobody holds the world up by themselves. We just each of us keep our own small time, tick, tick. And somehow, together, it comes out right.